The sound of knuckles hitting flesh is a sound that changes lives. It's not dramatic like in the movies. It's wet, ugly, and final. On a humid Tuesday evening in Atlanta, Georgia, Officer John Corle made that sound with his fist. He thought he was subduing an aggressive suspect who refused to comply during a routine traffic stop. He thought he was doing his job. He thought the sharp-tongued black woman in the designer suit who dared to quote constitutional law at him was just another entitled citizen who needed to be taught respect for the badge. What Officer John Corle didn't know, what he couldn't have known because Judge Sally James had been driving home in her personal sedan after a grueling day of sentencing hearings, was that the 40-year-old woman whose cheekbone he'd just shattered with a closed fist wasn't a suspect at all. And she was a Fulton County Superior Court judge, a woman who'd spent 12 years on the bench, presiding over the very cases that determined the fate of officers like him. A woman who had the power to send him to prison for decades. A woman who, in exactly 48 hours, would be sitting in her courtroom again, looking down at Officer John Corle from a position of absolute, devastating authority. This isn't just a story about police brutality. This is a story about the catastrophic speed of karma, about the lies we tell ourselves to justify violence, and about the terrifying moment when a predator realizes he hasn't been hunting prey, he's been poking a lion. And now, the cage door is open. Before we dive into this story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is going to challenge everything you think you know about power and consequences. Additionally, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I want to know if this story resonates with you, whether you're in New York, California, Texas, or anywhere in between. Now, let's get into it. Atlanta, Georgia. The city too busy to hate, they called it. A sprawling metropolitan hub where the Old South met the New South, where Dr. King's legacy lived in the streets, and where on any given Tuesday, 500,000 people were stuck in traffic, trying to get home before the summer heat turned their cars into ovens. Judge Sally James had been one of those people. At 40 years old, Sally was one of the youngest judges on the Fulton County Superior Court bench, and one of the most formidable. She'd graduated from Howard University School of Law at 25, spent 8 years as a prosecutor in the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, where she'd earned a reputation as a courtroom assassin, and had been appointed to the bench at 37 by a governor who recognized that the judiciary needed voices that understood what justice looked like from all perspectives. She was black, brilliant, and utterly unintimidating to look at, which was her greatest weapon. At 5'5", with natural hair she wore in a tapered cut, warm brown skin, and an easy smile, she looked like someone's cool aunt, like a woman you'd meet at brunch who'd give you relationship advice over mimosas. But in her black robes, behind that bench, with a gavel in her hand, Sally James was a force of nature. Defense attorneys prepared for her courtroom like they were preparing for battle. Prosecutors knew better than to come in unprepared. And defendants, even the hardest criminals, left her courtroom feeling like they'd been seen, heard, and judged by someone who actually understood the law. She was fair. She was tough. And she didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone, especially law enforcement officers who thought the badge was a license to do whatever they wanted. On this particular Tuesday, August 15th, Sally had presided over 7 hours of hearings in a sweltering courtroom where the air conditioning had failed at noon. She'd sentenced 2 men to prison for armed robbery, denied bail for a defendant charged with witness intimidation, and spent 45 minutes dressing down a defense attorney who'd shown up 30 minutes late with an excuse about traffic that Sally hadn't bought for a second. She was exhausted. At 6:45 p.m., she'd changed out of her robes in her chambers, declined an invitation to happy hour with 3 fellow judges, packed her leather briefcase with case files she'd review at home, and walked to the parking deck where she kept her personal vehicle. a 3-year-old Audi A4 that she'd bought used and loved fiercely. She didn't have a security detail. She didn't have a driver. Most Superior Court judges in Fulton County didn't, unless they were handling high-profile gang cases or organized crime. Sally's cases were serious, but they didn't typically generate death threats. She was just another professional leaving work, trying to beat the worst of the evening rush hour. She made it 8 blocks before Officer John Corle's blue lights filled her rearview mirror. Sally saw the flashing lights and felt the familiar irritation every driver feels when they realize they're being pulled over. She glanced at her speedometer. 33 in a 35 zone, not speeding. She mentally checked her car. Registration current. Insurance valid. Inspection sticker. Oh, the inspection sticker had expired 2 weeks ago. She'd noticed it last month, made a mental note to handle it, then gotten buried under a trial that lasted 3 weeks and completely forgot. It was the kind of minor administrative failure that responsible, busy people made all the time. The kind of thing that usually resulted in a warning, maybe a small ticket, and a reminder to get it handled within the next few days. Sally put on her signal, merged carefully into the right lane, and pulled into the parking lot of a shuttered Chick-fil-A. She rolled down her window, turned off the ignition, and placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The position every black driver in America learns, whether from parents or painful personal experience. In her purse on the passenger seat was her judicial ID, her driver's license, her state bar card, and her court-issued business cards. She would identify herself calmly, show her credentials, and this would be over in 3 minutes. That was the plan. Officer John Corle had been having the worst week of his already miserable month. He was 38 years old, 11 years on the Atlanta Police Department, and currently on his second marriage, which was circling the drain just like his first one had. His sergeant had written him up that morning for excessive force during an arrest 2 weeks ago, the third excessive force complaint in 18 months. His ex-wife's lawyer was threatening to drag him back to court for missed child support payments, and he'd just spent 2 hours dealing with a domestic call where a drunk husband had taken a swing at him and missed. But Corle had responded with a baton strike that left the guy with a fractured rib and was now being investigated. He was angry. He was stressed. And he was looking for someone to take it out on. When he'd spotted the Audi with the expired inspection sticker, he'd seen an opportunity. Nice car. Probably some wealthy tech bro or lawyer who thought the rules didn't apply to them. He'd enjoy reminding them that in his city, on his shift, the rules applied to everyone. He pulled in behind the Audi and ran the plates while he was still in his cruiser. The registration came back clean. Owner, Sally M. James. Address in Cascade Heights, one of Atlanta's historically black affluent neighborhoods. No warrants, no priors. Corle felt a flicker of disappointment. He'd been hoping for suspended license, outstanding warrant, something he could leverage. But an expired inspection sticker would have to do. He approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on his service weapon, not because he felt threatened, but because it was habit, and because the gesture established dominance before a single word was spoken. License, registration, and proof of insurance, Corle said without preamble, without greeting, his voice flat and aggressive. When Sally turned to look at him, she saw a white officer in his late 30s, medium height, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of face that might have been handsome once, but had been hardened by years of viewing every interaction as a potential conflict. "Good evening, officer," Sally said, her voice calm and professional. "I assume this is about my inspection sticker. I apologize. It expired 2 weeks ago. I've been meaning to get it renewed." Corle didn't acknowledge the politeness. He was already annoyed that she'd spoken before producing documents. "I said license, registration, and insurance. Now." Sally's hands remained on the wheel. "Of course. They're in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for my purse now. Do it slowly. Sally reached over deliberately, opened her purse, and pulled out her wallet. She extracted her driver's license and handed it through the window. Corle looked at it. Sally M. James, 40 years old, Cascade Heights address. The photo showed a professional-looking black woman with a slight smile. Registration and insurance, Corle repeated. They're in my glove compartment. I'm opening the glove compartment now. As Sally leaned forward and popped open the glove box, several papers fell onto the floor mat. Case files, legal briefs, nothing important, but now scattered at her feet. She retrieved the registration and insurance card and handed them to Corle. He looked at them, then looked at the papers on the floor. What's all that? Work documents, Sally said. I'm an attorney. It was true. Judges were attorneys. But Sally had learned over the years that telling police officers she was a judge during traffic stops sometimes made things weird. Some officers became overly deferential to the point of awkwardness. Others became hostile, viewing her as part of the system that second-guessed their decisions. So she usually just said, attorney, and left it at that. It was a mistake this time. An attorney, Corle repeated, and something ugly flickered across his face. He'd dealt with attorneys before, public defenders who filed motions to suppress evidence, civil rights lawyers who filed complaints about use of force. Attorneys were the people who made cops' lives difficult, who questioned every decision, who got guilty people off on technicalities. Step out of the vehicle, Corle said. Sally blinked. I'm sorry? I said step out of the vehicle. Don't know. Officer, I don't understand. This is an expired inspection sticker. I've provided my license, registration, and insurance. What's the issue? The issue, Corle said, his voice rising, is that you're questioning my instructions. Out of the car. Now. Sally felt the first real flutter of concern. This wasn't normal procedure. She'd been pulled over 3 times in her life, once in law school, once as a young prosecutor, once 5 years ago. And every time the officer had written a ticket and sent her on her way. None of them had ordered her out of the vehicle for a minor infraction. This felt wrong. Officer, I'd like to speak with your supervisor, Sally said, keeping her voice level and professional. You'll speak with whoever I tell you to speak with. Out. Now. Sally made a decision. She would comply. She would remain calm. And she would file a formal complaint tomorrow through the appropriate channels. She opened the door and stepped out. She was wearing a tailored navy blue pantsuit, Theory, purchased at Nordstrom, with a cream silk blouse and low black heels. She looked exactly like what she was, a successful professional at the end of a long workday. Corle saw something different. He saw a black woman in an expensive car who claimed to be an attorney, which probably meant paralegal or legal secretary, and who just questioned his authority in front of the dashcam. Turn around. Hands on the vehicle, Corle ordered. Officer, this is completely unnecessary. Hands on the vehicle. Sally placed her hands on the roof of her Audi, her heart pounding now. This had escalated from routine traffic stop to something else entirely, and she was trying to understand why. Corle moved behind her and began patting her down. His hands were rough, invasive, moving over her body in ways that had nothing to do with checking for weapons and everything to do with asserting dominance and humiliating her. This is inappropriate, Sally said, her voice tight with controlled anger. I am a professional woman. I have complied with every instruction. This search is unwarranted and I'll decide what's warranted, Corle interrupted. He found her phone in her jacket pocket and pulled it out. What's the password? You don't have the legal right to search my phone without a warrant, Sally said. The lawyer in her, the judge in her, fully awake now. I have the right to secure potential evidence. Evidence of what? An expired inspection sticker? Turn around, Corle said, or pulling out his handcuffs. You're being detained. Absolutely not, Sally said, turning to face him and pulling her hands off the car. You have no probable cause to detain me. I have broken no law except a minor administrative vehicle violation. I am exercising my Fourth Amendment right to refuse unlawful. That was the moment. The moment John Corle's fragile ego couldn't handle being lectured about constitutional law by a black woman who knew it better than he did. The moment his training failed him. The moment his anger became action. I said turn around, Corle shouted, grabbing Sally's arm and trying to spin her back toward the car. Sally pulled her arm away reflexively. Do not put your hands on me. Corle saw resistance, saw defiance, saw every attorney who'd ever made him look stupid in court, to every supervisor who'd ever questioned his judgment, every person who'd ever made him feel small. He drew back his right fist, and he punched Judge Sally James in the face. The sound was sickening. Knuckles on cheekbone, a wet crack that seemed to echo in the empty parking lot. Sally's head snapped sideways. White-hot pain exploded through her face, radiating from her cheekbone down through her jaw. She tasted blood immediately as her lips split against her teeth. Her knees buckled and she caught herself against the hood of the Audi, her hands splaying out for balance. For 3 seconds, the world was just pain and shock and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. Then her training kicked in. Not legal training, survival training. The training every black person in America gets about what to do when violence happens. When the system turns against you, when you need to survive the moment so you can fight the battle later. She looked up at Corle through vision that was already starting to blur on the right side, where her eye was swelling. She memorized everything with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent 12 years evaluating evidence. His badge number? 4382. His nameplate, J. Corle. The way he was breathing hard, his fist still clenched, his eyes wide with a mixture of adrenaline and what looked like surprise at his own actions. You just assaulted me, Sally said. Her voice was thick with blood but absolutely clear. You assaulted a superior court judge. The words hit Corle like cold water. What? Sally reached into her jacket pocket, slowly, carefully, and pulled out the thin leather case that held her judicial credentials. She flipped it open and held it up with a hand that was remarkably steady given the circumstances. Sally M. James Judge, Superior Court, Fulton County, Georgia. Corle stared at the ID, then at Sally, then back at the ID. The blood drained from his face in a rush that left him visibly pale, even in the fading evening light. No, he whispered. No. You said you were an attorney. You didn't. I am an attorney, Sally said, blood running down her chin. I'm also a superior court judge, and what you just did, assaulting a judicial officer, is a felony in Georgia with a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years. She paused, wiping blood from her mouth with the back of her hand. I need you to call for a supervisor and medical assistance. You fractured my cheekbone, and I believe you've loosened at least one tooth. Corle's hand went to his radio, but he seemed frozen, unable to make his fingers work. Sally did it for him. She reached past him. He actually flinched when she moved and grabbed his radio from his shoulder mic. Dispatch, this is an emergency, Sally said into the radio, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made the dispatcher sit up straighter 20 miles away. This is Judge Sally James, Fulton County Superior Court. I am at the location of Officer John Corle, badge number 4382, in the parking lot of the Chick-fil-A at Campbellton Road in Cascade. I have been assaulted by Officer Corle during a traffic stop. I need a supervisor and medical assistance immediately. The radio was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then, Judge James. Ma'am, can you repeat that? You heard me correctly, dispatch. Officer Corle has physically assaulted me. I am injured and bleeding. Send a supervisor and EMS now. Yes, ma'am. Units responding. ETA 6 minutes. Sally handed the radio back to Corle. He took it with shaking hands. They stood there in the parking lot in silence, the evening traffic humming past on Cascade Road, the summer heat still oppressive even though the sun was starting to set. Sally leaned against her car, holding a tissue from her pocket against her mouth. Corle stood 6 feet away, looking like a man who'd just watched his entire life collapse in real time. 5 minutes later, 3 patrol cars and an ambulance arrived simultaneously, their lights turning the parking lot into a strobing nightmare of red and blue. The first officer out of the lead patrol car was Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a 22-year veteran who'd seen every kind of situation the streets of Atlanta could produce. But when she saw Judge James, a judge she'd testified before multiple times, standing by her car with blood on her face and her suit, and Officer Corle standing nearby looking like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole, Rodriguez knew immediately that this was the kind of situation that ended careers and made national news. Judge James, Rodriguez said, approaching carefully. Ma'am, what happened here? Sergeant Rodriguez, Sally said. She'd testified in Sally's courtroom 8 months ago in a drug trafficking case. Officer Corle conducted a traffic stop for an expired inspection sticker. He ordered me out of my vehicle. I'd conducted an inappropriate and invasive search, and when I attempted to assert my constitutional rights and requested a supervisor, he struck me in the face with a closed fist. Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went cold and hard. She turned to Corle. Is this true? Corle opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at Sally, then at Rodriguez, then at the growing crowd of officers who were arriving on scene. She was resisting, Corle tried, his voice cracking. She pulled away when I tried to detain her. She was combative and I was standing still, Sally interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses with surgical precision. I pulled my arm away once when he grabbed me without cause. That is not resistance. That is a normal human response to unwanted touching. I never raised my hand. I never made a fist. I never threatened Officer Corle in any way, and then he punched me in the face. The paramedics were approaching now with their kit, but Sally held up a hand. Before they treat me, I want photographs taken. I want the dash cam footage from Officer Corle's vehicle secured immediately. I want his body camera footage secured. And I want the watch commander notified that a felony assault on a judicial officer has occurred. Rodriguez nodded. Judge, I need you to let the medics treat you. But I'm securing Officer Corle's vehicle right now and impounding all his equipment as evidence. She turned to Corle. John, give me your weapon and your badge, right now. Sarge, you can't be serious. This is your weapon and your badge, now. The parking lot had gone silent. 6 other officers were watching. All of them knew what this meant. Corle, moving like a man in a dream, unholstered his service weapon and handed it to Rodriguez. Then he unpinned his badge, the badge he'd worn for 11 years, the badge that had been his identity, his authority, his shield, and placed it in her palm. Rodriguez looked at the badge, then at Corle. You're under arrest, John, for assault on a judicial officer, and deprivation of rights under color of law. As 2 officers moved forward to handcuff their colleague, Sally finally let the paramedics approach. They were gentle, professional, and visibly shaken by what they were treating. Ma'am, we need to transport you to Grady, one of them said. That cheekbone is definitely fractured, and we need to x-ray your jaw. Sally nodded, but before she let them lead her to the ambulance, she looked at Corle one more time. He was in handcuffs now, being walked to a patrol car like any other criminal. Their eyes met. Officer Corle, Sally said quietly, you made a choice tonight. You chose violence over patience. You chose your ego over your duty. And now you're going to learn what accountability actually looks like. She turned and walked to the ambulance, her back straight, her head high despite the blood and pain. Behind her, John Corle was placed in the back of a patrol car and driven away. Not to the station as a fellow officer, but to jail as a criminal defendant. The machine of justice had been activated, and it was hungry. By 10 p.m. that night, the story had leaked. Someone at the scene, probably one of the paramedics, or maybe a tow truck driver who'd been called to move Sally's Audi, had told someone, behind who'd told someone else, and within 2 hours the text message chain had reached a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who'd nearly dropped his phone when he'd read it. A PD officer arrested for punching Superior Court judge during traffic stop. By midnight, 3 news vans were parked outside Grady Memorial Hospital, where Sally was being treated in a private room on the secure floor usually reserved for law enforcement and high-profile patients. Inside that room, Sally sat on the edge of the hospital bed, refusing to lie down despite the doctor's protests. Her right cheekbone was fractured, a clean break that would heal, but would hurt for weeks. Her upper right lip had required 6 stitches. 1 tooth was loosened, but would likely stabilize. And she had a concussion mild enough that they weren't keeping her overnight, but serious enough that she'd been told not to drive, not to work, and not to make any major decisions for at least 48 hours. She'd ignored the last part immediately. Her sister, Diane, stood in the corner of the room, arms crossed, looking like she wanted to go find Officer Corle and finish what he'd started. Diane was 2 years younger than Sally, worked in corporate finance, and had always been the more hot-tempered of the 2 James sisters. "I want him in prison," Diane said, her voice shaking with fury. "Not suspended, not fired. Prison. General population. Let him see what it's like." "He will be," Sally said. Her voice was thick from the swelling and the stitches, but it carried the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly how the system worked. "But we have to do this right. We can't let emotion drive this. Everything has to be by the book." There was a knock at the door, and a man in a dark suit entered. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of face that had spent decades in courtrooms. "Judge James," the man said. "I'm Assistant District Attorney Marcus Webb. I prosecute police misconduct cases. I'm here to take your statement." Over the next 90 minutes, Sally walked ADA Webb through every detail of the traffic stop. The expired inspection sticker, Corle's immediate aggression, the inappropriate search, the demand that she exit the vehicle, her request for a supervisor, her attempt to assert her rights, and then the punch. Webb recorded everything, taking notes with the precision of someone who knew he was building a case that would be examined under a microscope. "The dashcam footage is being pulled right now," Webb said. "We've also secured Officer Corle's body camera, though preliminary reports suggest it was turned off during the encounter, which is itself a violation of department policy." "He turned it off?" Sally asked. "Either that or it malfunctioned. We'll know more when we examine it. But Judge, I want to prepare you. The department is going to try to control the narrative. They're going to say this was a misunderstanding, the tensions were high, that you didn't immediately identify yourself as a judge." "I showed him my driver's license," Sally said. "My full name. He could have run it through the system at any point. When he did, it would have flagged immediately that I'm a sitting judge. But you didn't verbally say I am a judge?" "I said I was an attorney, which is accurate. Now, all judges are attorneys, and I shouldn't have to announce my profession to avoid being assaulted during a traffic stop for an expired inspection sticker." Webb smiled grimly. "That's exactly what I needed to hear, because that's going to be their defense, that you concealed your identity. I didn't conceal anything, and even if I had, even if I'd said I was a waitress or a teacher or unemployed, that wouldn't justify what he did. You don't get to punch citizens because they assert their constitutional rights." "No," Webb agreed. "You don't." He closed his notebook. "Judge, I'm opening a criminal investigation tonight. Officer Corle will be formally charged within 24 hours, and I want you to know, I've been prosecuting police misconduct for 15 years. I've seen a lot of bad stops, but this is one of the clearest cases of unprovoked assault I've ever encountered." He paused. "He's going to prison." By Thursday morning, 40 hours after the assault, the city of Atlanta was in an uproar. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution had broken the story at 6 a.m. with a headline that was trending nationally by 7:30. A PD officer arrested after punching Superior Court judge during traffic stop. The article included Sally's name, her photo from the court website, and a statement from the Fulton County District Attorney's Office confirming that criminal charges were being filed. What really made the story explode, though, was the dash cam footage. Ada Webb had released it to the media at 9 a.m. with Sally's approval. She'd wanted the public to see exactly what had happened, unfiltered and undeniable. The footage was devastating. It showed Sally's Audi pulling over calmly. It showed her with both hands visible on the steering wheel. The audio caught her polite greeting, her calm explanation about the inspection sticker, her request for a supervisor. It showed Corle ordering her out. It showed his aggressive body language. And then, in brutal clarity, it showed him drawing back his fist and striking her. The video ended with Sally stumbling against the car, blood visible on her face, even in the grainy dash cam resolution. It had been viewed 14 million times by noon. The police union issued a statement at 10:30 a.m. calling for due process and suggesting that the footage didn't show the full context. The statement was ratioed within minutes by thousands of comments pointing out that there was no context that justified punching a woman in the face during a traffic stop for a minor violation. By 2 p.m., the police chief, Marcus Thompson, held a press conference. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 2 days. "Officer John Corle has been terminated from the Atlanta Police Department, effective immediately," Thompson said. "His actions were not consistent with our training, our values, or our standards. We are cooperating fully with the district attorney's investigation." A reporter shouted out, "Chief, well, how did this officer remain employed despite multiple excessive force complaints?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "We are reviewing all of Officer Corle's prior incidents. If there were failures in our oversight, we will address them." Another reporter, "Is Judge James pressing charges?" Judge James is cooperating with the investigation. But to be clear, when a judicial officer is assaulted, the state prosecutes automatically. This isn't about whether she wants to press charges. The state of Georgia is pressing charges. Meanwhile, in a small holding cell at the Fulton County Jail, John Corle sat on a concrete bench and watched his life fall apart on the TV mounted in the common area. He'd been denied bond at his initial appearance. The magistrate judge, a colleague of Judge James who knew her personally, had looked at the dash cam footage and declared Corle a flight risk and a danger to the community. He was in administrative segregation, separated from the general population, because ex-cops didn't last long in general pop. He wore an orange jumpsuit. He hadn't showered. His union rep had visited once, stayed for 10 minutes, and left looking grim. On the TV, footage of Judge James was playing. It was from a sentencing hearing 2 months ago, court TV footage from a high-profile case. Sally sat behind the bench in her robes, listening intently to a defendant, her expression serious, but not unkind. The footage cut to an interview with one of her law clerks. "Judge James is one of the most respected judges in the state," the clerk was saying. "She's fair, and she's brilliant. She follows the law to the letter. If you come into her courtroom prepared and professional, you'll get a fair hearing, whether you're a defendant, a prosecutor, or a defense attorney. But if you waste her time or disrespect the process, she will hold you accountable." The clerk paused. I can't imagine what Officer Corle was thinking, because now he's going to stand in front of her courtroom, not as an officer, but as a defendant, and he's going to learn exactly what accountability looks like. Corle closed his eyes. The machinery of justice, once activated, was unstoppable, and it was coming for him. 6 months later, The Fulton County Courthouse was a media circus. The trial of State of Georgia versus John Michael Corle had become more than just a local story. It had become a national conversation about police accountability, on judicial authority, and the casual violence that too often characterized interactions between law enforcement and black citizens, even when those citizens were among the most powerful people in the justice system. Every major news outlet had a crew outside. Court TV was broadcasting the proceedings live. Legal analysts were dissecting every motion, every witness, every objection. Inside courtroom 6D, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat in the gallery was taken. People stood in the back. The jury box held 12 Fulton County residents who'd been selected after 3 days of grueling voir dire. 8 women, 4 men, 7 black, 3 white, 2 Latino. They sat with notebooks, their faces serious, understanding the weight of what they were being asked to decide. At the defense table sat John Corle, looking smaller than he had in his uniform. He wore a cheap gray suit that didn't fit well, purchased with borrowed money because his savings had been drained by legal fees. His court-appointed attorney, a competent but overworked public defender named Gerald Hastings, sat beside him, flipping through a file with the resigned air of someone who knew he was playing a losing hand. At the prosecution table sat ADA Marcus Webb and his co-counsel, a sharp young prosecutor named Jennifer Chen, who specialized in police misconduct cases. They looked confident, but not cocky. They knew better than to take anything for granted. And in the gallery, sitting in the third row, was Judge Sally James. She'd taken medical leave for 2 weeks after the assault, then returned to the bench. Her cheekbone had healed, though she still had a small scar near her right eye that makeup couldn't quite cover. The tooth had stabilized. The psychological scars, the knowledge that she could be assaulted by the very officers who were supposed to protect her, would take longer to heal. She'd recused herself from this case, obviously. The presiding judge was the Honorable Thomas Bradford, a 68-year-old white judge with a reputation for being tough on everyone and intimidated by no one. Sally had requested to be present for the trial. She wanted Corle to see her, wanted him to remember what he'd done, wanted the jury to see the living, breathing human being he'd assaulted, not just the victim from the dashcam footage. "All right," the bailiff called. "The Superior Court of Fulton County is now in session, on the Honorable Thomas Bradford presiding." Judge Bradford entered from his chambers, his black robe flowing behind him. He was tall, distinguished, with silver hair, and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen every human failing imaginable, and was no longer surprised by any of it. "Be seated," Bradford said. He looked at the jury. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are here for the trial of State of Georgia versus John Michael Corle. The defendant is charged with aggravated assault, assault on a judicial officer, and deprivation of rights under color of law." He turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Webb, are you ready to proceed with opening statements?" "We are, Your Honor." Webb stood and approached the jury box. He didn't have notes. He didn't need them. "Members of the jury," Webb began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "What you're going to see and hear over the next few days is simple. On August 15th of last year, a 40-year-old Superior Court judge named Sally James was driving home from work. She was pulled over by the defendant for an expired inspection sticker, a minor administrative violation that typically results in a warning or a small ticket. Webb paused, looking at each juror. But instead of writing that ticket, Officer Corle escalated. He ordered Judge James out of her vehicle. He conducted an invasive, inappropriate search. When she, a lawyer, a judge, a woman who knows the law better than most people in this courthouse, when she attempted to assert her constitutional rights and requested a supervisor, Officer Corle made a choice. Webb's voice hardened. He chose violence. He drew back his fist, and he punched her in the face with such force that he fractured her cheekbone and split her lip. And then, ladies and gentlemen, he tried to cover it up. He tried to file a report claiming she'd been combative. He tried to justify his assault by saying she'd resisted. Webb walked back to the prosecution table and picked up a remote control. But we have something Officer Corle didn't count on. We have the truth. And the truth is on video. The lights dimmed. A large screen descended from the ceiling. And for the next 4 minutes, the courtroom watched the dashcam footage in complete silence. The footage was even more damning in a courtroom than it had been online. Every moment of Sally's politeness, every moment of Corle's aggression, every second leading up to the punch. And then the punch itself. Brutal, unnecessary, shocking. When the lights came back up, 2 of the jurors were crying. That, Webb said quietly, is what this case is about. Not about whether Judge James should have identified herself differently. Not about whether she should have been more compliant. But about whether an officer gets to punch a woman in the face because she knows her rights and dares to assert them. He looked directly at Corle. The answer is no, and the evidence will prove that beyond any reasonable doubt. Webb sat down. Judge Bradford turned to the defense table. Mr. Hastings, opening statement? Gerald Hastings stood slowly. He looked like a man about to walk into a burning building. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Hastings began, my client made a mistake. I'm not going to stand here and tell you he didn't. What you saw in that video was wrong. Officer Corle knows it was wrong. He's lost his job, his pension, his reputation because of one terrible decision made in a moment of high stress. Hastings paused. But I'm asking you to consider the context. Officer Corle had been an officer for 11 years. He'd made thousands of traffic stops without incident. He was trained to respond to perceived threats. When Judge James pulled away from him, when she refused his commands, he perceived, wrongly, but he perceived, that the situation was escalating. What he did was wrong, but it wasn't criminal. It was a mistake. The words hung in the air, thin and unconvincing. Hastings sat down. Even he looked like he didn't believe what he'd just said. Mr. Webb, Judge Bradford said, call your first witness. The state calls Judge Sally James. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sally stood and walked to the witness stand with her back straight and her head high. She wore a charcoal gray suit, different from the one that had been ruined with blood, and low heels. She looked professional, composed, and utterly formidable. The bailiff swore her in. Please state your name for the record, Webb said. Sally Michelle James. And your occupation? I'm a Superior Court judge for Fulton County, Georgia. I've held that position for 12 years. Webb walked her through her credentials. Howard Law, prosecutor for 8 years. Appointed to the bench at 37, presiding over criminal cases ranging from theft to murder. Then he got to August 15th. Judge James, can you tell the jury what happened that evening? Sally took a breath and began. She described leaving work exhausted, driving home, seeing the blue lights, pulling over immediately, placing her hands on the wheel, being polite, professional, compliant. I told Officer Corle that my inspection sticker had expired, Sally said. I apologized. I was prepared to accept whatever ticket or warning he was going to give me and handle it the next day. What happened instead? He became aggressive immediately. His tone was hostile from the first words out of his mouth. When I reached for my purse to get my license, he seemed annoyed that I was explaining what I was doing, even though I was doing exactly what civilians are taught to do to keep officers safe. Did you identify yourself as an attorney? I did. When he asked about papers in my car, I said they were work documents and that I was an attorney, which is true. All judges are attorneys. Did you identify yourself as a judge? No. I've learned over the years that sometimes telling officers I'm a judge during traffic stops makes things complicated. Some officers become overly nervous, others become hostile. I just wanted to get home. Webb nodded. Walk us through what happened when he ordered you out of the car. Sally described the invasive search, the way Corle's hands had lingered, the way he'd invaded her personal space in a way that felt deliberately humiliating. When he reached for his handcuffs, I said, "Absolutely not." Because at that point, I knew something was very wrong. This wasn't normal procedure. I hadn't done anything to warrant arrest or detention. So I asserted my rights. I said I wanted a supervisor. I said that what he was doing was unconstitutional. How did Officer Corle respond? He grabbed my arm. I pulled away reflexively, not aggressively, just instinctively, the way anyone would when someone grabs them roughly. And then he punched me. Sally's voice didn't waver. She wasn't crying. She wasn't dramatic. She was simply stating facts in the same tone she used in her courtroom every day. Can you describe the impact? It felt like my face exploded. Immediate pain, blinding pain. I tasted blood. My vision blurred. I thought for a second that I might pass out. She paused. And then I was angry. Because I'd done nothing wrong. I'd followed every rule, asserted my rights calmly and professionally, and I'd been assaulted for it. Webb let that sit. Judge James, now you could have told Officer Corle immediately that you were a judge. Why didn't you? Because I shouldn't have to. Whether I'm a judge, a teacher, a waitress, or unemployed, I have constitutional rights. Those rights don't depend on my profession. Officer Corle didn't assault me because he didn't know I was a judge. He assaulted me because I knew my rights, and I refused to be bullied. It was a perfect answer, and Hastings knew it. When Webb finished his questioning, Hastings approached for cross-examination. He looked uncomfortable. Judge James, Hastings began carefully. You said you pulled away when Officer Corle grabbed you. Could that have been interpreted as resistance? Sally looked at him steadily. Mr. Hastings, if someone grabs you roughly without justification, and you instinctively pull back, is that resistance? Or is that a normal human response? I'm asking the questions, ma'am. Then let me answer yours directly. No. Pulling my arm away once from an unlawful grab is not resistance. Resistance implies active opposition to lawful authority. What Officer Corle was doing was not lawful. But Officer Corle didn't know you were a judge. That's irrelevant, Sally interrupted, her voice sharp. Even if I'd been a waitress or a student, his actions would have been just as wrong. You don't get to assault people because they assert their constitutional rights, regardless of who they are. Hastings tried a few more questions, but he was outmatched. Sally had spent 12 years cross-examining witnesses. She knew every trick, every trap, every angle. She answered each question with precision, never giving him an opening. Finally, Hastings gave up. No further questions. Sally stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat in the gallery. Corle wouldn't look at her. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. After Sally testified, Webb called the paramedics who treated her. They described the fracture, the lacerations, the blood. They showed photographs, horrible clinical images of Sally's battered face taken at the hospital. He called the sergeant who'd responded to the scene, who testified that Corle had seemed panicked and disoriented, and had initially tried to claim that Sally had been combative, a claim contradicted by the video evidence. He called a use of force expert, a retired police captain who reviewed the footage and stated unequivocally that Corle's actions violated every principle of appropriate police response, that there was no justification for the punch, and that any reasonable officer would have known it was excessive. Most devastatingly, he called 3 of Corle's former colleagues. The first was Officer Maria Rodriguez, who'd been at the scene. She testified that she'd worked with Corle for 5 years and had witnessed him escalate situations unnecessarily on multiple occasions. Officer Corle had a reputation, Rodriguez said quietly. He didn't like to be questioned. If you asserted your rights, if you asked for a supervisor, he took it personally. He saw it as disrespect. The second was a former partner of Corle's who'd requested a transfer after 6 months working with him. I was afraid he was going to get me sued or killed, the officer said. He treated every interaction like a fight he had to win. I tried to tell our sergeant, but nothing was done. The third was the sergeant who'd written Corle up for excessive force 3 times. I tried, the sergeant said, his voice heavy with regret. I documented everything, but the union protected him. The department didn't want the paperwork, so he kept his badge, and now we're here. By the time the prosecution rested after 4 days of testimony, the defense had nothing. Hastings called a psychologist who testified about stress and split-second decision-making, but on cross-examination, Webb got the psychologist to admit that nothing in the video showed a split-second decision. It showed a calculated, deliberate punch. Hastings called a character witness, Corle's ex-wife, who testified that he was a good father to their kids, but on cross-examination admitted that she'd divorced him because of his anger issues and his inability to control his temper. Corle himself didn't testify. Hastings made the calculation that putting him on the stand would be suicidal. The closing arguments were brutal. Webb was surgical. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Corle wants you to believe this was a mistake, but mistakes are accidental. Pulling back your fist, aiming at someone's face, and striking with enough force to fracture bone, that's not a mistake, that's a choice. And that choice was a crime. Hastings tried to appeal to sympathy. My client lost everything. His job, his pension, his reputation. Hasn't he suffered enough? But as Webb pointed out in his rebuttal, Judge James lost something too. She lost her sense of safety, so she lost the naive belief that the badge would protect her, and she gained a scar on her face that will remind her every day what happens when power goes unchecked. The defendant's suffering is self-inflicted. Hers was inflicted by violence. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman, a 62-year-old black woman who'd been a teacher for 30 years, stood with a piece of paper in her hand. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Bradford asked. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of aggravated assault, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." "On the charge of assault on a judicial officer?" "Guilty." "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law?" "Guilty." Corle closed his eyes. The fight had gone out of him weeks ago. In the gallery, Sally sat perfectly still. She didn't smile. I didn't cry. Just nodded once, acknowledging that the system, her system, had worked. 3 weeks later, John Corle stood before Judge Bradford for sentencing. The courtroom was packed again, though the media presence had thinned slightly. The verdict had been the story. Sentencing was the epilogue. Hastings stood and made his final plea for mercy. He talked about Corle's 11 years of service, his 2 children, his struggles with stress, and PTSD from the job. Judge Bradford listened without expression. Then he turned to Corle. "Mr. Corle, do you have anything to say before I impose sentence?" Corle stood. He looked at Sally, who sat in the same third-row seat she'd occupied throughout the trial. "Judge James," Corle said, his voice breaking, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't undo what I did. But I'm sorry." Sally's expression didn't change. Bradford cleared his throat. "Mr. Corle, I've been a judge for 32 years. I've sentenced rapists, murderers, armed robbers. I've seen the worst humanity has to offer. But what you did disturbs me on a level that few cases have." He leaned forward. "You were given a badge. You were given authority. You were given the power to arrest, to detain, to use force when necessary. That power comes with a sacred responsibility. You violated that responsibility in the worst possible way. You assaulted a woman, not because she was dangerous, not because she threatened you, but because she had the audacity to know her rights and assert them. Bradford picked up a document. The sentencing guidelines suggest 10 to 20 years. The prosecution has asked for the maximum. Your attorney has asked for leniency. He paused. I'm sentencing you to 15 years in the Georgia Department of Corrections. No parole eligibility for 7 years. You will also be permanently barred from law enforcement in any capacity in the state of Georgia. Corle's knees buckled. Hastings caught him. Furthermore, Bradford continued, I'm ordering you to pay full restitution to Judge James for her medical expenses and pain and suffering. The amount will be determined at a separate hearing. He banged his gavel. Bailiff, remand the defendant. As they led Corle out in handcuffs, he looked back at Sally one last time. She was already walking out of the courtroom, her head high, her purpose served. 1 year later, Atlanta had changed in small but significant ways. The Atlanta Police Department had implemented mandatory de-escalation training. Body cameras could no longer be turned off during citizen interactions. An independent civilian oversight board now reviewed all use of force incidents. And the department had hired Dr. Sally James's former law clerk as their new compliance officer, someone who understood what constitutional policing actually meant. The changes hadn't fixed everything. They never could. But they were a start. Sally sat in her chambers on a Wednesday afternoon, reviewing case files for the next day's docket. The scar near her eye had faded, but was still visible. She'd stopped trying to cover it with makeup. It was part of her story now. There was a knock on her door. Come in, Sally called. Her law clerk, a bright young woman named Jessica, entered with a folder. Judge, the Martinez sentencing is ready for tomorrow, and you have a visitor. Sally looked up, puzzled. I don't have any appointments scheduled. I know. But she said it was important. It's Maria Rodriguez, the sergeant who responded to the incident. Sally hesitated, then nodded. Send her in. Sergeant Rodriguez entered, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes. She'd taken a day off to be here. Judge James, Rodriguez said. Thank you for seeing me. Have a seat, Sergeant. Rodriguez sat, her hands clasped in her lap. I wanted to come by and... I don't know. Apologize isn't the right word, because I didn't do anything wrong that night. But I wanted you to know that what happened to you, it changed things at the department. Not just the policy changes, the culture. Officers are different now. They're more careful, more respectful, because they saw what happened when someone forgot that the badge is about service, not power. Sally nodded slowly. I also wanted to tell you, Rodriguez continued, that I testified at 3 more excessive force trials this year. Officers who thought they were untouchable. Your case gave prosecutors the courage to actually charge them, and it gave officers like me the courage to speak up. That's good, Sally said. That's what should happen. Rodriguez stood to leave, then paused at the door. You could have taken an extended leave, could have retired, could have let this break you, but you came back to the bench. You kept doing the work. That matters, Judge. It matters that you didn't let him win. After Rodriguez left, Sally sat alone in her chambers for a long time. She thought about that night in the parking lot. The fear, the pain, the blood. She thought about the trial, watching Corle try to justify the unjustifiable. She thought about the sentencing, the way his face had crumpled when Bradford read 15 years. And she thought about all the people who didn't have her credentials, her position, her ability to fight back. The people who got assaulted by officers and had no recourse, no video evidence, no ADA willing to prosecute. Her job wasn't done. It would never be done. But every day she sat on that bench, every ruling she made, every officer she held accountable, it was a small victory in a very long war. She picked up the next case file and got back to work. 3 years later, in a medium-security prison 2 hours south of Atlanta, John Corle mopped the floors of the prison law library. He was 41 years old. He'd served 3 years of his 15-year sentence. He had 4 more years before he'd even be eligible for parole, and given the nature of his crime, parole was unlikely. Prison had aged him. His hair was almost completely gray. He'd lost 30 pounds. The physical bulk that he'd used to intimidate people had melted away, replaced by the kind of thinness that comes from stress and bad food and the constant low-level fear that defines prison life. He was in protective custody. He'd never survived general population. Ex-cops didn't. But even in PC, he was at the bottom of the hierarchy. The child molesters looked down on him. The snitches had more status. He'd lost his wife. His second divorce had been finalized 6 months into his sentence. He'd lost his kids. They'd stopped visiting after the first year. He'd lost his pension, either his savings to legal fees, and any hope of rebuilding his life. All because of one punch. On the TV in the common room, the news was playing, a story about police reform in Atlanta, and there was Judge Sally James, now 43 years old, speaking at a panel about judicial oversight of law enforcement. She looked strong, healthy, powerful. She'd won. Corle pushed his mop bucket toward the next aisle and tried not to think about what his life might have been if he'd just written the ticket, smiled, and told her to have a nice evening. But that was the thing about power. It made you think you were invincible right up until the moment it destroyed you. And karma? Karma didn't rush. It took its time. It built its case. It gathered its evidence. And then it struck with the force of law. The story of John Corle and Judge Sally James is a reminder that power unchecked becomes poison. For years, Corle operated under the belief that his badge placed him above accountability, that compliance meant submission, and that questioning authority was a crime worthy of violence. But the law has a long memory, and when Corle made the catastrophic decision to punch a woman who had the knowledge, the resources, and the position to fight back, he activated a system that was designed for exactly this purpose: to hold power accountable. Judge James didn't win because she was a judge. She won because she was right. But the fact that she had to be a judge to get justice, that's the tragedy underlying this story. Because for every Sally James who gets vindication, there are countless others who suffer the same violence and have no recourse. This story isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that protects bad cops until they attack someone with power. It's about the culture that enables violence, and it's about the urgent need for reform, oversight, and accountability. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to understand why police accountability matters. Subscribe so you never miss stories about justice, power, and the moments when the tables turn.